When my parents walked away from me at Grand Central Station in Chicago on a rainy October afternoon, leaving me standing alone with nothing but a backpack and $27, I thought it was some kind of test. A cruel game that would end when they came back laughing, telling me it was all a joke. I was 12 years old, and I believed my parents when they said, "Let's see if she can find her way home, Emma. Smart girls always do." I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I had no idea that moment would define the next 35 years of my life, or that finding my way home would become something far more complicated than catching the right train. My name is Emma Richardson, and I'm 47 now. I live in a quiet neighborhood in Portland, Oregon, with my husband Michael and our 2 teenage daughters. I work as a social worker specializing in family reunification, helping children navigate the system when their families fall apart. People often ask me how I got into this line of work, what drew me to such emotionally demanding cases involving abandoned and neglected children. The answer is simple, though I rarely share it. I understand what it feels like to be thrown away. Growing up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, I was the middle child in what everyone considered a picture-perfect family. My father, Robert Richardson, was a successful automotive engineer at Ford Motor Company. He wore crisp white shirts to work every morning and came home exactly at 6:15 each evening, his briefcase in one hand and the Detroit Free Press tucked under his arm. My mother, Patricia, was a homemaker who prided herself on keeping an immaculate house and serving dinner at precisely 6:30 every night. My older brother, David, was the golden child, brilliant in mathematics and destined for engineering like our father. He was 15, 3 years older than me, with sandy brown hair and our father's analytical mind. Everything came easily to David: grades, sports, social situations. He had this way of solving problems with calm logic that made our parents beam with pride. My younger sister Jessica was 8, the baby of the family with curly blonde hair and enormous blue eyes that could melt anyone's heart. She was sweet and compliant, the kind of child who colored inside the lines and never questioned authority. Jessica was everyone's favorite, though they'd never admit it openly. And then there was me, 12 years old, with unruly dark hair that refused to stay in the neat braids my mother preferred, and a stubborn streak that seemed to surface at the worst possible moments. I asked too many questions, challenged rules that didn't make sense, and had an unfortunate tendency to point out inconsistencies in adult logic. In a family that valued order and compliance, I was the anomaly. Our house on Maple Street was a 2-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn and flower beds that my mother tended with obsessive care. Inside, everything had its place. Books arranged by height on the shelves, magazines fanned precisely on the coffee table, not a dish left unwashed or a toy out of place. It was beautiful and suffocating all at once. I remember feeling like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying to fit into a mold that wasn't made for me. When David brought home straight A's, it was celebrated with his favorite dinner and proud phone calls to relatives. When Jessica performed in the school play, the whole family attended with flowers and cameras. When I won the regional science fair with my project on water pollution in the Great Lakes, my father glanced at the trophy and said, "That's nice, Emma. Try not to track mud in the house." It wasn't that they were cruel, exactly. They provided for all my basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, education. But there was something missing in how they looked at me, as if they were constantly disappointed by what they saw. I felt like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit no matter how hard I tried to reshape myself to match their expectations. The first real crack in our family's perfect facade appeared during the summer before 7th grade. I had developed what my mother called an attitude problem, and what I now recognize as a normal 12-year-old's desire for independence and self-expression. I questioned why I had to wear the clothes she picked out, why I couldn't choose my own activities, why every aspect of my life had to be planned and controlled by other people. These weren't dramatic rebellions. I wasn't sneaking out or getting into trouble at school. I was simply asserting small preferences, like wanting to read science fiction novels instead of the appropriate books my mother selected, or preferring to spend time in the library rather than at the mall with girls from school who seemed to speak a language I didn't understand. But in our household, any deviation from the established order was treated as a crisis, My parents began having hushed conversations behind closed doors, conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. I caught fragments of their discussions, words like difficult, defiant, and most hurtingly, nothing like the other two. The tension reached a breaking point in early October. I had refused to participate in a family portrait session, not because I was trying to be difficult, but because I was deep into reading a fascinating book about marine biology and genuinely didn't understand why we needed another identical family photo when we already had dozens. My mother's reaction was swift and disproportionate. "Emma Richardson, you are the most selfish, ungrateful child I have ever encountered," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "We have given you everything, and all you do is make our lives more difficult. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to have a daughter who fights us on every single thing?" I remember staring at her, confused by the intensity of her response. In my 12-year-old mind, not wanting to sit for a formal photograph hardly seemed like a capital offense. But the look in her eyes, a mixture of frustration, disappointment, and something that looked almost like disgust, made my stomach drop. That night, I heard my parents talking in their bedroom, their voices carrying through the thin walls of our colonial house. "She's getting worse, Robert," my mother was saying, "more defiant every day. David and Jessica are such easy children, but Emma," her voice trailed off. "Maybe it's just a phase," my father replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "All kids go through rebellious periods. This isn't a normal rebellion. This is something deeper. She's just different, and not in a good way." The words hit me like physical blows. Different, not in a good way. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what was so fundamentally wrong with me that my own parents found me unbearable. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in our house grew increasingly strained. My parents seemed to be watching me constantly, documenting every small act of independence as evidence of my inherent defiance. When I chose to sit in a different spot at dinner, it was seen as rebellious. When I asked why we always had to eat the same meals on the same days of the week, it was interpreted as challenging their authority. David and Jessica began treating me differently too, as if my parents' disappointment was contagious. David, who had always been protective of his younger sisters, started distancing himself, spending more time in his room or with friends. Jessica, sensitive to the family dynamics even at 8 years old, seemed confused and a little afraid, as if she wasn't sure whether talking to me might get her in trouble too. I felt increasingly isolated in my own home, like I was living with strangers who spoke a language I couldn't understand. Every interaction felt loaded with unspoken criticism and disappointment. I began spending more time at the public library, partly because I loved reading, but mostly because it was the only place where I felt like I could breathe without someone monitoring my every move. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman in her 60s who seemed to understand my love of learning for its own sake. She introduced me to books about astronomy, archaeology, and deep-sea exploration, subjects that fired my imagination and made me feel like the world was vast and full of possibilities. For a few hours each day, surrounded by books and the gentle quiet of the library, I could forget about the tension at home and lose myself in stories of discovery and adventure. But even this small refuge became a source of conflict. My mother complained that I spent too much time reading, that it wasn't normal for a 12-year-old girl to prefer books to socializing. She worried that I was becoming antisocial, though I had friends at school and got along well with my teachers. The real issue, I now understand, was that my interests and preferences didn't align with her vision of who I should be. Looking back, I can see that my parents were overwhelmed by a child they didn't understand. They had a clear template for success, David's academic achievements and Jessica's easy compliance, and I didn't fit that mold. Rather than adapting their expectations or trying to understand my different learning style and personality, they seemed to view me as a problem to be solved, or, failing that, a burden to be managed. The final confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in mid-October. I had stayed late at the library working on a research project about renewable energy sources, something that fascinated me but wasn't part of any school assignment. When I came home, dinner was already over, and my parents were waiting for me in the living room with expressions I had never seen before. "Sit down, Emma," my father said, his voice eerily calm. "We need to talk." The living room felt different that Tuesday evening, like the air itself had thickened with unspoken decisions. My mother sat rigidly on the edge of the cream-colored sofa, her hands folded in her lap with white knuckles. My father stood behind her, one hand resting on the back of her chair in what looked like support but felt more like restraint. David and Jessica were nowhere to be seen, though I could hear the faint sound of the television from upstairs. "Your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking," my father began, his voice carrying that measured tone he used for difficult conversations at work. "About our family, about what's best for everyone involved." I shifted uncomfortably in the armchair across from them, my backpack still slung over one shoulder. The research materials I'd been so excited about at the library suddenly felt heavy and irrelevant. Something in their posture, in the careful way they weren't quite meeting my eyes, made my stomach clench with a fear I couldn't name. "We love you, Emma," my mother said, though her voice sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced these words in front of a mirror. "But love sometimes means making difficult decisions." The word "but" hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. In my 12 years of life, I had learned that nothing good ever followed when adults began sentences about love with "but." "You're clearly unhappy here," my father continued, fighting us at every turn, resisting every attempt we make to guide you. "It's not healthy for you, and it's not fair to David and Jessica." The implications stung. Not fair to my siblings, as if my mere existence was somehow damaging to them. I wanted to argue, to point out that I wasn't fighting them so much as trying to understand why every preference I expressed was treated as an act of rebellion. But something in their expressions warned me that this wasn't a conversation where my input was welcome. "We've decided," my mother said, her voice gaining strength as if she'd found her resolve, "that it might be best for everyone if you learned some independence, some self-reliance. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." The words were carefully chosen, clinical almost. Independence. Self-reliance. They made abandonment sound like a gift. "We're going to take a little trip this weekend," my father announced. "To Chicago. There's something we want you to experience." Chicago. The word meant nothing to me then except a distant city I'd seen on maps. A place that seemed as foreign as another planet. I had no relatives there, no connections that would make such a trip meaningful. But I was 12, and despite the growing knot in my stomach, I still trusted that my parents wouldn't deliberately hurt me. "What kind of experience?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know the answer. My parents exchanged a look that I couldn't read at the time but now recognize as the silent communication of two people who have already made an irreversible decision. "A learning experience," my mother said finally, "about responsibility and problem solving." The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. On the surface, everything continued as usual. School, homework, family dinners at 6:30 sharp. But underneath, there was a current of tension that made every interaction feel charged with hidden meaning. My parents were overly polite to me, treating me with the careful courtesy they usually reserved for difficult relatives or repair workers. David seemed to sense something was wrong, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what. He started hovering around me more than usual, offering to help with homework he'd never shown interest in before, suggesting we play board games we hadn't touched in years. It was as if some part of him knew this might be his last chance to be a protective older brother, though he couldn't consciously acknowledge why he felt that way. Jessica, with the intuitive sensitivity of youngest children, became clingy and anxious. She followed me around the house, asking random questions, and wanting to help with tasks that didn't require assistance. When I asked her what was wrong, she just shrugged and said everything felt different, though she couldn't explain how. I found myself studying my parents with new intensity, trying to decode their behavior. My mother spent hours on the phone with someone, her voice too low for me to hear the words, but her tone urgent and conspiratorial. My father cleaned out his desk with unusual thoroughness, throwing away papers and files he'd kept for years. They were both preparing for something, though I had no idea what. Friday evening, my mother laid out clothes for me. Practical things like jeans, sweaters, and my most comfortable walking shoes. When I asked why I needed to dress for hiking in Chicago, She said the weather might be unpredictable and it was better to be prepared. Pack light, she instructed, handing me my smallest backpack. Just essentials. We won't be gone long. Essentials. I remember standing in my room, staring at my belongings, and trying to decide what qualified as essential for a mysterious trip to Chicago. I packed a few changes of clothes, my toothbrush, the book I was currently reading, and a small notebook where I kept lists of interesting facts I'd learned at the library. I also tucked in the $27 I'd saved from birthday money and small allowances, money my parents didn't know I had. Looking back, I wonder if some part of me already knew what was coming. The way I carefully chose my most comfortable clothes, the way I included every dollar I could find, the way I lingered over photographs and mementos before ultimately leaving them behind. Maybe children have an instinct for survival that kicks in before their conscious minds can process the danger. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of October weather that makes everything look bleak and unwelcoming. My father loaded a small suitcase into the trunk of our blue sedan, while my mother double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked. David and Jessica weren't coming with us. They were staying with our next-door neighbors, the Kellys, for what my parents called a quiet weekend at home. The 3-hour drive to Chicago passed mostly in silence. I sat in the back seat, watching the familiar landscape of suburban Detroit give way to farmland, and then gradually to urban sprawl. My parents spoke occasionally about traffic or road signs, but there was no discussion of our destination or purpose. The radio played soft rock stations, filling the car with generic melodies that somehow made the silence between us feel even more pronounced. I tried several times to ask questions about our plans, but each inquiry was met with vague responses about seeing the city and, quote, having an adventure. My mother kept checking her watch, as if we were operating on some kind of schedule one wasn't privy to. My father drove with unusual focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When we finally reached Chicago, I was amazed by the size of it. The towering buildings, the crowds of people, the constant noise of traffic and construction and life happening at a pace I'd never experienced. Coming from the quiet suburbs of Detroit, the city felt overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once. We drove through downtown, past office buildings and shops and restaurants that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. I pressed my face to the window, trying to take it all in, wondering what my parents wanted me to experience in this vast, impersonal place. Finally, we pulled into a parking garage near what my father identified as Grand Central Station. Not the famous one in New York. This was Chicago's version, a sprawling transportation hub where buses and trains converged from across the Midwest. The building was enormous, all concrete and glass and echoing spaces filled with travelers hurrying to unknown destinations. "This is it," my mother said, though she didn't explain what it was. We walked through the main terminal, our footsteps echoing on the polished floors. The place was buzzing with activity. Business travelers with their briefcases and newspapers, families with children and mountains of luggage, elderly couples consulting schedules and maps. Everyone seemed to know where they were going, except us. My father led us to a row of hard plastic chairs near the departure boards, where we sat and watched trains and buses come and go. For almost an hour, we just sat there, my parents occasionally exchanging looks but saying nothing about why we were there or what we were waiting for. Then my father stood up and walked to a ticket window, returning with what looked like a single bus ticket. My heart started beating faster, though I still didn't understand why. "Emma," my mother said, her voice carefully controlled, "we want you to understand something important about life." And that's when they told me about the test. "Life is about proving yourself," my father said, settling back into the plastic chair beside me. "About showing that you have what it takes to overcome challenges and find solutions." The bus ticket in his hand caught the harsh fluorescent light of the terminal. I could see it was one way, though I couldn't make out the destination from where I sat. My mother reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper, which she placed carefully on the seat between us. "This contains our home address," she explained, her voice taking on the tone she used when explaining household rules, "and some basic information about transportation options from Chicago back to Detroit." My 12-year-old brain struggled to process what they were telling me. transportation options from Chicago back to Detroit. As if I would need to find my own way home. As if they weren't planning to take me back with them. We've talked to other parents, my mother continued, and they all agree that children today are too dependent, too sheltered. They don't develop real problem-solving skills, because everything is handed to them. Other parents. I wondered who these mythical other parents were. These people who apparently thought it was normal to abandon their children in strange cities as character-building exercises. Even at 12, something about this explanation felt wrong. Felt rehearsed in a way that didn't quite ring true. "You're a smart girl, Emma," my father said, and for a moment his voice carried a hint of the warmth I remembered from when I was younger. "Smarter than most adults give you credit for. You've been telling us for months that you don't need our guidance, that you can make your own decisions." The twist of logic was breathtaking in its cruelty. My desire for small freedoms, choosing my own books, asking questions about family rules, was being reframed as a declaration of complete independence. As if wanting to pick out my own clothes was the same as claiming I could survive alone in a major city. "So we're going to let you prove it," my mother said. "Show us that you really are as capable and independent as you claim to be." She held out the bus ticket, and with a shock that made my hands tremble, I saw the destination, Detroit Metropolitan Transit Center. A ticket home, but only if I could figure out how to use it. "The bus leaves in 45 minutes, my father said, checking his watch. "That gives you time to study the information we've provided, maybe ask questions at the information desk, figure out where you need to go." I stared at them, waiting for the punchline, for the moment when they would start laughing and tell me this was all an elaborate joke. But their faces remained serious, almost businesslike, as if abandoning their daughter was just another item on their weekend to-do list. "What if I can't figure it out?" I whispered. "What if I get lost?" "Then you'll learn to ask for help," my mother replied. "You'll discover resources you didn't know you had. You'll become stronger." The clinical way she spoke about my potential terror and confusion was perhaps the most chilling part of the entire conversation. She wasn't talking about my fear. She was talking about my character development, as if being abandoned was some kind of educational opportunity. "We'll be checking with the Detroit terminal," my father added. "If you make it back safely, we'll know you've learned something valuable about self-reliance." If I made it back safely, the conditional nature of that statement hit me like a slap. They were genuinely uncertain whether their 12-year-old daughter would survive this test they'd devised. "And if I don't make it back?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. My parents exchanged another one of those looks, the kind that had become so common over the past few weeks. This time I thought I saw a flicker of something that might have been doubt in my mother's eyes, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "You will," my father said with the confidence of someone who had never been lost or scared or truly alone. "Because you have to. Because that's how people grow up." They stood up then, both of them, and I realized with a shock that they were preparing to leave. Not in 45 minutes when my bus departed, but right now. They were going to walk away and leave me sitting in this echoing terminal with nothing but a bus ticket and a piece of paper with directions I was too panicked to comprehend. "Wait," I said, scrambling to my feet. "You're leaving now?" "The longer we stay, the harder this will be for all of us," my mother said, though she wouldn't meet my eyes. "This is the right thing to do, Emma. Someday you'll understand that." My father reached out and awkwardly patted my shoulder, the gesture stiff and formal, like he was saying goodbye to a distant relative. "Remember what we've taught you about being resourceful. Trust yourself." And then they turned and walked away. I stood frozen, watching their retreating figures navigate through the crowd of travelers. My mother's red coat became a distant splash of color, then disappeared entirely behind a group of college students with backpacks. My father's measured stride carried him steadily toward the exit without once looking back. The reality of my situation hit me in waves. First came disbelief. Surely they would turn around, come back, admit this had gone too far. Then came panic as I realized they really were gone. That I was truly alone in a place I'd never been before with no clear idea of how to get home. Finally came a strange, hollow numbness, as my 12-year-old mind tried to protect itself from the enormity of what had just happened. I sat back down in the plastic chair, the bus ticket clutched in my shaking hand, and forced myself to read the paper my mother had given me. The information was sparse and clinical. The address of our house in Detroit, the phone number of the bus terminal, a brief note about purchasing tickets, and finding the correct departure gate. What it didn't include was any acknowledgement that I was a child who had never traveled alone before, who had never been responsible for navigating public transportation, who had never been anywhere without adult supervision. The directions assumed a level of competence and street smartness that I simply didn't possess. Around me, the terminal continued its chaotic rhythm. Announcements echoed from overhead speakers, calling out departure times and gate changes in a metallic voice that seemed designed to be heard over the constant noise of conversations and footsteps and rolling luggage. Families hurried past, parents keeping careful track of their children, making sure no one got separated in the crowd. I watched a mother counting her 3 young children, touching each one's shoulder to confirm they were all present before moving toward their departure gate. The casual way she protected them, the automatic assumption that children needed guidance and care, made my chest ache with a loneliness so profound I could barely breathe. The ticket in my hand was for a bus leaving in 37 minutes. 37 minutes to figure out where the departure gate was, how to confirm my seat, whether I needed identification or additional documentation. 37 minutes to transform from a sheltered suburban 12-year-old into someone capable of independent travel across state lines. I looked around the terminal, trying to identify the information desk my father had mentioned. There were several official-looking counters, but they all had long lines of people waiting for assistance. Adults with complex travel questions, families trying to resolve ticket problems, elderly passengers needing help with heavy luggage. How was I supposed to approach one of these busy officials and explain that my parents had abandoned me with a bus ticket and expected me to find my own way home? What adult would believe such a story? And even if they did believe it, what would they do? Call the police? Child Protective Services? The thought of strangers getting involved, of my parents being questioned about their parenting methods, filled me with a terror that was almost worse than the fear of being lost. Whatever was wrong with our family, whatever had led to this moment, I still couldn't imagine deliberately getting my parents in trouble. They were still my parents, and despite everything, some part of me believed they must have reasons for what they were doing. So I sat in that hard plastic chair, surrounded by the overwhelming noise and movement of the train station, and tried to figure out how to save myself without betraying the people who had put me in danger in the first place. The clock on the wall showed 32 minutes until departure. 29 minutes. I forced myself to stand up, my legs unsteady beneath me. The practical part of my brain, the part that had always gotten me good grades and helped me solve complex problems, finally kicked in over the emotional chaos. I needed to find the departure gate, and I needed to do it now. The terminal stretched out before me like a maze of corridors and signs pointing in different directions. Gate A through M were to the left, N through Z to the right. My ticket showed Gate R, which meant navigating through the crowd toward the far end of the building. As I walked, clutching my backpack and the precious bus ticket, I became acutely aware of how different I looked from the other solo travelers. Business people strode confidently with their briefcases and rolling luggage. Teenagers moved in groups with the casual assurance of kids who belonged somewhere. Elderly passengers moved slowly, but with the dignity of people who had earned their independence through decades of life experience. I was just a 12-year-old girl with a small backpack, trying not to cry in public. The corridor to Gates NZ was longer than I had anticipated, lined with shops selling newspapers, snacks, and travel accessories. The smell of coffee and fast food made my stomach growl, reminding me that we hadn't eaten since breakfast. But I didn't dare spend any of my $27 on food. I had no idea what unexpected expenses might arise during this journey home. Gate R turned out to be at the very end of the corridor, a small waiting area with about 30 plastic chairs arranged in rows facing a large window that looked out onto the bus loading platform. Through the glass, I could see several buses in various stages of departure preparation. Drivers checking their vehicles, baggage handlers loading cargo compartments, passengers beginning to form lines. But which bus was mine? The sign above the gate showed 3 different departure times and destinations. Detroit was listed for 3:47 p.m., which matched my ticket, but there were also buses to Milwaukee and Indianapolis leaving within the same hour. The waiting area contained a mix of passengers, and I couldn't tell which group I was supposed to join. 22 minutes. An older woman sitting near the window noticed my confusion. She had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her floral dress and sensible shoes reminded me of Mrs. Henderson from the library back home. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice gentle with genuine concern. "You look a little lost." For a moment, I was tempted to tell her everything, to explain that my parents had abandoned me here as some kind of test, that I was scared and confused and didn't know if I was even in the right place. But the shame of admitting that my own parents had found me so difficult they'd literally thrown me away was too overwhelming. "I'm just trying to figure out which bus goes to Detroit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The 347? She asked, glancing at the schedule posted on the wall. "That's my bus, too. I'm visiting my granddaughter at the University of Michigan." Relief flooded through me. At least I was in the right place. "Is there anything special I need to do? Any paperwork or identification?" She studied me more carefully, taking in my youth and obvious nervousness. "Do you have your ticket?" I showed her the ticket, and she nodded approvingly. "That's all you need, dear. Though I have to say, you seem awfully young to be traveling alone." "Are your parents picking you up in Detroit?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Were my parents planning to pick me up in Detroit? The thought hadn't even occurred to me. I had been so focused on the immediate challenge of getting to the bus and making the journey that I hadn't considered what would happen when I arrived. The paper my mother had given me contained our home address, but no mention of anyone meeting me at the terminal. I think so," I stammered, though I was no longer certain of anything. The woman's expression grew more concerned. "Honey, you think so?" "Don't you know for sure?" Before I could answer, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Now boarding bus 847 to Detroit, departing at 3:47 p.m. All passengers please proceed to the loading platform." The other travelers in our section began gathering their belongings and moving toward the door that led outside to the buses. The woman who had been questioning me stood up, shouldering a small purse and pulling a rolling suitcase behind her. "Come on, dear," she said, gesturing for me to follow. "Let's get you on that bus." I fell into step behind her, grateful for someone who seemed to know what they were doing. We joined the line of passengers filing through the door, presenting tickets to a uniformed driver who checked each one and directed people toward the correct bus. The Detroit bus was a large, modern vehicle, with tinted windows and comfortable-looking seats. As I climbed aboard, the driver, a middle-aged black man with a friendly smile, checked my ticket and looked at me with the same concerned expression I was getting used to. "Traveling alone today?" he asked. "Yes, sir," I replied, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Well, you stick close to Mrs. Patterson here," he said, nodding toward the silver-haired woman who had helped me. "She's a regular on this route. Margaret will take good care of you." Mrs. Patterson. Margaret smiled and guided me toward 2 seats about halfway back in the bus. "You can sit by the window if you'd like, sweetheart. The scenery between here and Detroit is quite lovely this time of year." As other passengers boarded and found their seats, Margaret kept up a gentle stream of conversation that helped calm my nerves. She told me about her granddaughter studying pre-med at the university, about her own career as a high school English teacher before retirement, about her late husband who had been a bus driver himself for 30 years. "He always said you could tell a lot about people by how they handled travel," she mused as the bus pulled away from the terminal. "Whether they were patient with delays, kind to fellow passengers, resourceful when things didn't go according to plan." I wondered what my parents thought my behavior on this trip would tell them about my character. Did they expect me to panic and call for help, proving that I was too dependent? Or did they hope I would rise to the challenge and somehow emerge stronger? As Chicago's skyline disappeared behind us and we entered the flat farmland of Indiana, I found myself thinking about what strength actually meant. Was it strong to leave a 12-year-old alone in a strange city? Was it strong to refuse help when you desperately needed it? Was it strong to protect parents who had put you in danger? Margaret dozed in the seat beside me as the afternoon wore on, and I pressed my face to the window, watching the landscape roll by. Cornfields and small towns, highway rest stops and industrial buildings, all of it foreign territory to a girl who had rarely been outside the Detroit suburbs. The bus made several stops along the way: Kalamazoo, Battle Creek, smaller towns whose names I didn't recognize. At each stop, a few passengers got off and new ones got on, changing the dynamics and energy of our small traveling community. I watched families reuniting with loved ones, business travelers checking their phones and schedules, elderly passengers moving carefully down the narrow aisle. At the Battle Creek stop, a young mother boarded with 2 small children, a boy who looked about 6 and a girl maybe 4 years old. The mother was clearly stressed, juggling diaper bags and snacks and trying to keep track of both children as they explored their new environment with boundless curiosity. When the little girl started crying because she couldn't find her stuffed rabbit, I helped look under the seats until we located it wedged between cushions 3 rows back. The mother thanked me profusely, and for a few minutes, I felt useful and competent in a way I hadn't experienced since leaving the library in Detroit. "You're very good with children," Margaret observed quietly after the family had settled into their seats. "Do you have younger siblings?" "A younger sister," I said, thinking of Jessica with a pang of homesickness so sharp it made my chest ache. "She's 8. "She's lucky to have a big sister like you," Margaret said. "You're very mature for your age." Mature for my age. Adults had been telling me that my entire life, usually when they were about to ask me to handle something beyond what was normally expected of a child. "Be mature, Emma. Be responsible, Emma. Figure it out yourself, Emma, because you're so mature for your age." But sitting on that bus, watching the mother struggle with her 2 young children, I realized that maturity wasn't the same thing as readiness. I might be mature enough to help find a lost toy or engage in adult conversations, but that didn't mean I was ready to navigate cross-state travel alone or figure out how to get home from a bus terminal in a city I'd never visited. As we approached the Detroit metropolitan area, the anxiety I'd been holding at bay for hours came rushing back. In less than 30 minutes, I would be standing in another unfamiliar terminal, faced with the challenge of finding my way across a major city to a suburban home my parents might or might not be expecting me to reach. Margaret must have sensed my growing nervousness because she reached over and patted my hand gently. "Everything will be all right, dear," she said. "Whatever's waiting for you in Detroit, you'll figure it out. You're stronger than you know." I hoped she was right. But as the bus pulled into Detroit's Metropolitan Transit Center, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of my journey was just beginning. The Detroit Metropolitan Transit Center was nothing like the orderly, well-lit facility I'd imagined. As our bus pulled into the depot, I could see through the windows that this was a grittier, more industrial part of the city. The building itself was older, with concrete walls stained by years of exhaust and weather, and the surrounding neighborhood looked rough even to my sheltered suburban eyes. Margaret gathered her belongings as passengers began filing off the bus. "Do you know how you're getting home from here, sweetheart?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I pulled out the crumpled paper my mother had given me and studied it again. Our address in the Detroit suburbs was clearly written, but the transportation instructions were vague. City bus routes available to suburban areas. Check the information desk for current schedules and connections. "I think I need to take city buses," I said, though I had never ridden Detroit city buses before. Our family always drove everywhere in our suburban bubble. Margaret frowned. "Honey, it's getting dark, and some of those bus routes can be challenging for someone your age. Are you sure there's no one coming to pick you up?" The question that had been haunting me throughout the bus ride now demanded an answer. Were my parents expecting me to somehow appear at home? Had they made arrangements I wasn't aware of? Or was figuring out the final leg of the journey part of their test? "I'm supposed to figure it out myself," I said, the words sounding hollow and strange coming out of my mouth. Margaret's expression shifted from concern to something approaching alarm. "Supposed to figure it out? Child, what kind of adults leave a 12-year-old to figure out city transportation alone at night?" Before I could respond, we were swept along with the crowd of passengers disembarking. The terminal was indeed older and more chaotic than Chicago's facility. The lighting was harsh and uneven, casting strange shadows in corners, where small groups of people lounged in ways that made me uncomfortable. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with something I couldn't identify, something sharp and unpleasant that made my nose wrinkle. Margaret stayed close to me as we made our way through the terminal, her protective presence a comfort I didn't want to lose. At the information desk, a tired-looking woman behind bulletproof glass provided us with a handful of bus route maps and schedules that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Route 16 connects to the suburb line, the woman said without looking up from her magazine. Runs every hour until midnight. Catch it at the stop outside, east side of the building. Margaret studied the maps with the intensity of someone trying to decode a military strategy. These routes are confusing even for adults, she muttered. And some of these neighborhoods... She trailed off, shaking her head. Outside the terminal, the October evening had turned cold and damp. Streetlights created pools of yellow illumination surrounded by deep shadows, and the bus stop was little more than a sign posted next to a cracked sidewalk. A handful of other people waited in the gathering darkness. Workers heading home from late shifts, teenagers in groups that seemed more intimidating than friendly, an elderly man who kept talking to himself in a voice too low to understand. "I don't like this," Margaret said firmly. "I cannot in good conscience leave you here alone." Quote, "Part of me wanted to accept her protection, to let this kind stranger take charge and somehow make everything safe and manageable. But another part, the part that had been labeled difficult and defiant by my parents, recognized that accepting help would mean admitting defeat in whatever twisted test they had devised. "I'll be okay," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Really, I just need to take this bus to the connection point, then catch the suburban route." Margaret looked at me for a long moment, and I could see her internal struggle. She clearly wanted to help, but she was also a stranger who had her own life and responsibilities. After what felt like an eternity, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small piece of paper. "This is my phone number," she said, pressing it into my hand. "If you get into any trouble at all, you call me to collect. Do you understand? I don't care what time it is." The gesture was so unexpectedly kind that tears sprang to my eyes. A complete stranger was offering me more support and safety than my own parents had provided. "Thank you," I whispered, carefully folding the paper and putting it in my jacket pocket next to my remaining money. "Promise me you'll call if you need help," Margaret insisted. "Promise me." "I promise." She hugged me then, a quick, fierce embrace that smelled like lavender and safety. Then she walked back toward the terminal to catch her own transportation, leaving me alone at the bus stop with my fear and determination warring in my chest. The Route 16 bus arrived 20 minutes later, a lumbering vehicle that wheezed to a stop with a hiss of air brakes. The driver was a large man who barely glanced at me as I fumbled with my money, trying to figure out the correct fare from the confusing signs posted near his seat. 75 cents, he said impatiently as other passengers boarded behind me. I handed over 3/4 from my carefully hoarded money and found a seat near the front, hoping that staying close to the driver would offer some protection if needed. The bus was only about half full, but several passengers made me nervous, a man who kept staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl, a group of teenagers who were loud and aggressive in their interactions with each other. As we pulled away from the terminal and began navigating Detroit's inner-city streets, I realized how sheltered my suburban upbringing had been. The neighborhoods we passed through were unlike anything I had ever seen. Abandoned buildings with boarded windows, empty lots filled with debris, clusters of people gathered on street corners in ways that suggested activities I didn't want to understand. I pulled out the bus route map and tried to follow our progress, but the street names mentioned on the schedule didn't match what I could see through the windows in the darkness. When we stopped to pick up more passengers, I listened carefully to the driver's announcements, trying to identify the connection point where I was supposed to transfer to the suburban route. 40 minutes into the journey, the bus pulled into what looked like another transportation hub, smaller than the main terminal but still a complex intersection of different bus routes. Several passengers got off, and I heard the driver call out suburban connections in his tired voice. This was my stop. I gathered my backpack and made my way off the bus, stepping into another dimly lit area that felt even less safe than the main terminal. The suburban bus stop was supposed to be nearby, but the signs were confusing, and some of the streetlights were broken, creating pockets of darkness that made me nervous. A group of older teenagers noticed me immediately, a 12-year-old girl alone with a backpack, clearly out of place in this environment. They started walking in my direction with the casual predatory movement of people who had spotted easy prey. "Hey, little girl," one of them called out. "You lost something?" Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was in an unfamiliar area with no clear escape route. I started walking quickly toward what I hoped was the suburban bus stop, but they followed, their footsteps echoing behind me on the empty sidewalk. "We're just trying to help," another voice said, but the tone carried menace rather than assistance. I reached into my pocket and felt Margaret's phone number, the small piece of paper that represented the only lifeline I had in this increasingly dangerous situation. But even if I found a payphone, even if I called her collect, how long would it take her to reach me, and what would happen in the meantime? That's when I saw the suburban bus approaching in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. If I could just reach the bus stop, if I could just get on that bus, I would be one step closer to home and safety. But the teenagers were getting closer, and I realized with growing terror that my parents' test had evolved into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. This wasn't about building character or teaching independence. This was about survival in an urban environment that no 12-year-old should have to navigate alone. As the bus drew closer and the footsteps behind me quickened their pace, I made a decision that would haunt me for decades. Instead of running toward the bus stop, instead of trying to flag down the driver, I ducked into an alley between two buildings and pressed myself against the wall, hoping the darkness would hide me until the danger passed. The suburban bus, my ride home, rumbled past the empty bus stop and disappeared into the night, taking with it my best chance of completing the journey my parents had forced me to begin. The alley was darker than I had expected, filled with the kind of shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I pressed my back against the cold brick wall, trying to make myself as small as possible while listening to the voices of the teenagers who had been following me. "Where'd she go?" one of them asked, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and amusement. "Can't have gone far," another replied. "Probably hiding somewhere around here." I could hear their footsteps moving closer to the mouth of the alley, and I realized with growing panic that I had trapped myself. The alley appeared to be a dead end, blocked at the far end by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. If they decided to search the shadows where I was hiding, there would be nowhere left to run. The smell of garbage and something else, something sour and unpleasant, filled my nostrils as I tried to control my breathing. Somewhere in the darkness, I could hear the scurrying of small animals, rats probably, and the distant sound of traffic from the main street seemed impossibly far away. Minutes passed like hours as I waited in the darkness, listening to the voices gradually fade as the group moved on to look for easier targets. Only when I was certain they were gone did I dare to move, creeping carefully toward the alley entrance and peering out at the now empty street. The suburban bus was long gone, and according to the schedule I'd studied, the next one wouldn't arrive for another hour. An hour of waiting alone at that bus stop, exposed and vulnerable to anyone who might pass by. The thought made my stomach clench with fear. But as I stood at the edge of that alley, something inside me shifted. The terror of the past few minutes had burned away the last of my naive trust in my parents' judgment. This wasn't a character-building exercise. This was abandonment. Pure and simple. They had put me in genuine danger, and whether or not I survived their test was apparently less important to them than proving some twisted point about independence. I pulled out Margaret's phone number and the small amount of money I had left. There was a payphone visible about half a block away, near what looked like a 24-hour convenience store. The store's bright lights and the presence of other people, customers coming and going, offered the promise of relative safety. Walking to that payphone required crossing an open stretch of sidewalk, where I would be visible to anyone watching, but staying in the alley wasn't an option. I took a deep breath, shouldered my backpack, and walked as quickly as I could toward the store. The convenience store was a beacon of normalcy in an increasingly surreal night. Through the windows, I could see a middle-aged clerk behind the counter, a customer buying cigarettes, another person browsing the snack aisles. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. Proof that not everyone in this part of the city was dangerous. The payphone stood just outside the store's entrance, an ancient device that looked like it hadn't been serviced in years. I had never made a collect call before, but the instructions posted on the phone were clear enough. With shaking fingers, I dialed the operator and gave them Margaret's number. "I have a collect call from Emma," the operator said when Margaret answered. "Will you accept the charges?" "Yes, of course." Margaret's voice came through the static, immediate and concerned. "Emma, honey, where are you? Are you all right?" The sound of her voice, so warm and caring after the terror of the past hour, broke something loose inside me. I started crying, not the quiet tears I'd been holding back all day, but deep, shaking sobs that made it hard to speak. "I'm scared," I managed to say between sobs. "I'm lost, and I missed the bus, and there were these people following me, and I don't know what to do." "Where are you right now?" Margaret asked, her voice calm but urgent. "Are you somewhere safe?" I looked around at the convenience store, its bright lights and steady stream of customers. "I think so. I'm at a payphone outside a store." "But Margaret, I don't think I can get home tonight. The next bus isn't for an hour, and I'm too scared to wait at the bus stop alone." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Margaret thinking. When she spoke again, her voice was firm with decision. "Give me the address of where you are. I'm coming to get you." "But you don't even know me," I protested, "and it's so far out of your way." "Emma, listen to me," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades teaching and caring for young people. "Whatever situation led to you being alone in that part of the city at night, it's not acceptable. You're a child, and no child should have to handle this kind of danger alone." I read her the address from the store's window, and she promised to be there within 45 minutes. "Stay inside the store if they'll let you," she instructed. "Buy something small so you have a reason to be there." And Emma? Whatever adults in your life thought this was a good idea, they were wrong. The store clerk was initially suspicious when I entered with my backpack and tear-stained face. But when I explained that I was waiting for a ride and bought a small bottle of water with some of my precious remaining money, he relaxed and even let me sit on a plastic chair near the front window where I could watch for Margaret's car. As I waited, I thought about what I would tell my parents when I finally got home. The test they had devised had failed spectacularly, but not in the way they had intended. Instead of proving I was too dependent and sheltered, the evening had shown me that their judgment was dangerously flawed. Adults who truly cared about a child's welfare didn't abandon them in strange cities as character-building exercises. Margaret arrived exactly when she had promised, her small sedan pulling up to the curb with the reliability of someone who kept her word. I had never been so happy to see another person in my life. "Oh, sweetheart," she said as I climbed into her car, the interior warm and safe and smelling faintly of the lavender perfume I remembered from the bus. "You look exhausted." "I am," I admitted, settling into the passenger seat with relief so profound it made me dizzy. As we drove through Detroit's suburbs toward my family's address, Margaret asked gentle questions about my situation. I found myself telling her everything, about my parents' disappointment in my personality, about their belief that I needed to learn independence, about the test that had nearly ended in disaster. Margaret listened without judgment, though I could see her hands tightening on the steering wheel as I described the day's events. "Emma," she said finally, "what your parents did today isn't normal, it isn't healthy, and it certainly isn't safe." "But maybe they're right," I said, voicing the doubt that had been haunting me all day. "Maybe I am too difficult, too defiant. Maybe normal parents wouldn't have felt like they needed to do something so drastic." Margaret pulled the car over to the curb and turned to face me directly. "Listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Children are supposed to have opinions. They're supposed to ask questions and express preferences and sometimes disagree with their parents. That's not defiance. That's normal, healthy development." She paused, studying my face in the streetlight. Adults who can't handle normal childhood behavior, who respond to it by putting a child in danger, are the ones with the problem, not the child. The words hit me like a revelation. For months, I had been accepting my parents' assessment that something was fundamentally wrong with me. that my natural curiosity and independence were character flaws that needed to be corrected. But sitting in Margaret's car, safe and warm after hours of genuine fear, I began to consider the possibility that the problem wasn't with me at all. When we finally pulled into my family's driveway, the house was dark except for a single light in the living room window. Margaret walked me to the front door, her presence a buffer between me and whatever awaited inside. My father answered the door in his pajamas and robe, his face showing surprise at seeing me with an unfamiliar adult woman. "Emma," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "we weren't expecting you so late." "This is Margaret Patterson," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected. "She helped me get home safely." Margaret stepped forward, and I could see something steely in her expression despite her polite smile. "Mr. Richardson, I think we need to have a conversation about what happened to your daughter today." Quote, the look that crossed my father's face, surprise, followed quickly by something that might have been fear, told me that he was beginning to realize their test had gone very wrong indeed. The living room felt different when we entered, smaller somehow, less impressive than it had seemed that morning when my parents had announced their plan. My mother appeared from the kitchen, still dressed despite the late hour, her face a carefully composed mask that couldn't quite hide her anxiety. "Emma," she said, her voice carrying forced brightness, "you made it home. We knew you would." Margaret's presence seemed to fill the room with an energy that made my parents visibly uncomfortable. She was still wearing her floral dress from the bus trip, but something about her posture and expression commanded respect in a way that transcended her grandmother's appearance. "Mrs. Richardson, I presume," Margaret said, her voice polite but carrying an undertone of steel. "I'm Margaret Patterson. I had the pleasure of meeting your daughter on the bus from Chicago today." My mother's smile faltered slightly. "How nice. Emma, why don't you go upstairs and get ready for bed? I'm sure you're tired after your adventure." "Actually," Margaret said firmly, "I think Emma should stay. What I have to say concerns her directly." The word adventure hung in the air like an insult. Margaret had heard enough of my story during the drive to understand that what my parents had put me through was far from an adventure. My father gestured toward the sitting area. "Please, Mrs. Patterson, have a seat. Can we offer you some coffee? Tea?" "No, thank you," Margaret replied, but she did sit down in the armchair I had occupied that Tuesday evening when this nightmare began. "I'll be direct, Mr. and Mrs. Richardson. Your daughter spent this evening alone in one of Detroit's most dangerous neighborhoods, hiding from teenagers who were following her with clearly harmful intentions, missing her bus connection because she was afraid for her safety." My mother's face went pale. "Dangerous neighborhood? That can't be right. We researched the transportation routes carefully." "Did you?" Margaret asked, her eyebrows raised. "Did your research include visiting these locations at night? Speaking with other parents who had sent 12-year-old children on similar journeys? Consulting with child development experts about the psychological impact of abandonment?" Quote, "It wasn't abandonment," my father said quickly. "It was a learning experience, a test of resourcefulness and independence." Margaret turned to look at him with an expression that could have frozen water. "Mr. Richardson, I was a high school teacher for 37 years. I've seen every kind of parenting philosophy you can imagine, but in all my years of working with children and families, I have never encountered parents who thought it was appropriate to abandon a 12-year-old in a strange city as a teaching tool." "We didn't abandon her," my mother protested. "We gave her everything she needed: transportation, money, clear instructions. We were confident in her abilities." "You gave her a bus ticket and $27, Margaret said, her voice rising slightly. "You sent a sheltered suburban child into urban environments she had never experienced, at night, with no backup plan and no safety net. If I hadn't happened to be on that bus, if I hadn't given her my phone number, your daughter would have spent the night on the streets of Detroit." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. I could see my parents processing Margaret's words, perhaps beginning to understand for the first time what their test had actually entailed. "But she's fine," my father said weakly. "She made it home safely. She proved she could handle the challenge." "She proved she could survive your neglect," Margaret corrected sharply. "There's a difference between building character and endangering a child's life." I found my voice for the first time since entering the house. "I wasn't fine," I said quietly. "I was terrified. I didn't know if you were going to pick me up in Detroit, or if I was supposed to figure out how to get home from there too." I didn't know if this was really a test or if you were just getting rid of me because you think I'm too difficult. My mother's composure finally cracked. Emma, of course we weren't getting rid of you. You're our daughter. We love you. Then why does it feel like you're disappointed in me all the time? I asked, the question that had been building inside me for months finally emerging. Why does everything I do that's different from David and Jessica get treated like a problem that needs to be fixed? My parents looked at each other, one of those silent conversations passing between them. But this time, instead of excluding me from their decision-making, their exchange seemed to include a recognition that they owed me an answer. We don't know how to parent you, my mother said finally, her voice small and defeated. David is so easygoing, and Jessica follows directions without question. But you challenge everything. You ask why when we need you to just do what we say. You want explanations for rules that have always worked for our family. And that scares us, my father added, his voice barely above a whisper. We look at you and we see intelligence and independence that we don't know how to guide. We worry that if we don't establish clear boundaries now, you'll become completely uncontrollable as a teenager. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. So your solution was to traumatize her into compliance? That wasn't our intention, my mother said quickly. We thought if she could prove to herself that she was capable of handling difficult situations, she would gain confidence and stop fighting us on smaller issues. Instead, Margaret said quietly, you taught her that the people who are supposed to protect her are willing to put her in danger when she doesn't meet their expectations. The words hung in the air like an indictment. I could see my parents beginning to understand the real impact of their actions. The way their attempt at tough love had actually been a profound betrayal of trust. Emma, my father said, turning to face me directly, I'm sorry, we thought we were helping you grow stronger, but we see now that we were wrong. We've been treating your independence like a flaw instead of a gift, my mother added, tears beginning to form in her eyes. We've been so focused on making you fit our expectations that we forgot to appreciate who you actually are. Margaret nodded approvingly. That's a start. But Emma needs more than apologies. She needs to know that this will never happen again, and she needs to see concrete changes in how you respond to her normal developmental needs. Over the next hour, with Margaret serving as both mediator and advocate, my parents and I had the most honest conversation we had ever shared. They admitted their fear of my independence, their uncertainty about how to parent a child who didn't fit their template for success. I expressed my frustration with feeling constantly judged, my confusion about why my natural curiosity was treated as defiance. Margaret suggested family counseling, a concept that seemed foreign to my parents but which they agreed to consider. She also recommended books about child development and parenting techniques for strong-willed children, resources that might help them understand that my personality traits weren't flaws to be corrected, but strengths to be channeled. When Margaret finally prepared to leave, she pulled me aside for a private moment. Emma, she said, I want you to understand something important. What happened today wasn't your fault. You didn't cause your parents to make poor decisions by being who you are. You are a bright, capable, wonderful young woman, and any parent should be proud to have a daughter like you. She handed me a piece of paper with her address as well as her phone number. I'm going to stay in touch, she said. I want to make sure you're okay, and I want to see how you grow up. Because I have a feeling you're going to do remarkable things with your life. The months that followed weren't easy. My parents and I attended family counseling sessions where we learned new ways to communicate and resolve conflicts. My mother slowly began to appreciate my love of reading and learning, even when my interests didn't match her expectations. My father started asking about my science projects instead of dismissing them. The relationship with David and Jessica took longer to repair. They had been confused and frightened by the tension in our house, unsure whether my parents' treatment of me meant they were also at risk of disappointing the family. Gradually, as our parents learned healthier ways to handle disagreement and independence, the whole family dynamic improved. I kept in touch with Margaret for years, sending her updates about school achievements, college acceptance letters, my wedding invitation, and eventually photos of my own children. She became the grandmother figure I had never had, someone who believed in my potential from the moment we met on that bus. Now, at 47, Working with families in crisis every day, I understand my parents better than I did at 12. They were young themselves, overwhelmed by a child they didn't understand, lacking the tools and knowledge to handle strong-willed behavior constructively. Their decision to abandon me in Chicago was wrong. Dangerously, inexcusably wrong, but it came from fear rather than malice. The experience taught me that finding your way home isn't always about navigation or transportation. Sometimes it's about finding people who see your worth, who validate your right to be yourself, who refuse to let you disappear into danger alone. Margaret Patterson died peacefully in her sleep 5 years ago, surrounded by her family and the many young people whose lives she had touched over the decades. At her funeral, I met dozens of former students who had similar stories. Moments when Margaret had stepped in during a crisis, offered support when no one else would, seen potential in children that others had written off. My parents are in their 70s now, and our relationship has evolved into something I never thought possible during that dark October when I was 12. They've become proud of the independence they once feared, supportive of the career that grew from my childhood trauma, grateful for the grandchildren who inherited both my stubbornness and my compassion. But I never forgot the lesson of that night in Chicago and Detroit. Children aren't problems to be solved, or tests to be passed. They're human beings deserving of protection, guidance, and unconditional love, even when they don't fit the mold their parents expected. Every child I work with now gets a piece of that lesson. Every family I counsel hears Margaret's voice echoing through my words. That strength comes not from surviving abandonment, but from knowing you have people who will never let you face the darkness alone. Sometimes the most important journey isn't about finding your way back to where you started. Sometimes it's about discovering that home isn't a place at all. It's the people who see you, value you, and refuse to let you disappear. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.